Hi, good afternoon, everyone. We are hoping that you're all doing good, and we also thank you for investing your time with us. So, on behalf of CISA, we welcome you all to the webinar for Mass Guidelines for Risk Management. Introducing myself, I am Bharat Malik, and your host for the webinar today. I lead the global sales hunting team at CISA. I'm going to cover some of the quick facts about CISA now. So we are a forensic driven global cybersecurity company having 1,000 plus active engagements every year. And we've also served more than 2,000 plus global customers having presence in 40 plus countries till date. One of the key differentiating factors for CISA is that we are one of the top 4 global payment forensic investigator approved by the PCI Council. We're also a renowned brand recognized by Visa, MasterCard, Amex, Discover. And not only this, we are also accredited by CREST, and we are a trusted service provider for vulnerability assessment and penetration testing services. Moving on, I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Mr. Kaushik. Mr. Kaushik has handled several information security audits, and he has been involved in several leading banks, third-party payment processors, and payment gateways as well. Some of the housekeeping items for the webinar today. This webinar is going to last for 45 minutes, and this will also include 15 minutes of the Q&A. All the attendees will be on mute automatically for the smooth flow of the webinar. And there is a Q&A section located right below your screen. If you've got any questions that arise during the webinar, you can feel free to share your questions over there. And we'll be happy to take that up at the end of the webinar within that 15 minutes time slot. So without any delay, I'm pleased to welcome Mr. Kaushik to take over the platform now. Kaushik, over to you.
Thanks a lot for that, Bharat. And good afternoon, everyone who have joined in from, let's say, Singapore and let's say the other neighboring countries. Thanks a lot for this particular session, also for joining in over here. This mass webinar, I believe that all of you are quite aware about, let's say, what exactly is mass, or let's say, what exactly does it conceptualize. So for those of you who might not know, MAS stands for, of course, the Monetary Authority of Singapore. And they are responsible to make sure that the financial institutions, specifically in the Singapore region, are secured specifically from, let's say, the cyber security threats, vulnerabilities, and things like that. And recently, let's say in January 2021, these guys came up with an updated guideline on the technological risk management, that how exactly organizations in this COVID era should be taking care of, let's say, their cybersecurity posture, their cybersecurity governance, and many other things followed as well. And the entire notion, the entire, you can say, the motive, why exactly, let's say, MAS has to come out with these updated guidelines, specifically in the COVID era, because MAS had seen that, okay, how many, or let's say, what are different kinds of breaches, what are different kinds of vulnerabilities, what are different kinds of threat exposures are having in the entire market, due to which they had to take this particular call and launch this particular guidelines as well. And that is how we'll be going ahead with the entire session as well. That is, first of all, we'll explain to you that why exactly MAS actually came out with these particular guidelines. We'll talk about the current cybersecurity state of Singapore as well. We'll talk about that, okay, how exactly the scope and the applicability of these MAS guidelines have been taken into perspective as well. And in between, we'll pause and talk about that what exactly are the financial institutions, because for those of you who are quite aware about the MAS guidelines, they are specifically applicable, or let's say the scoping and the applicability is all around the financial institutions. So we'll be talking about different types of financial institutions as well, that, okay, what are different types of are there. Post which, we'll be talking about the comprehensive list of security controls which mass has, let's say, requested financial institutions to take into perspective, and accordingly, let's say, make sure that, okay, their organizations and things like that have been secure as well. Post which we'll talk about why to implement these guidelines. After which, of course, as a company, a security consulting company, it's a job, it's a roles and responsibility to communicate to you guys that, okay, how exactly to implement these guidelines, how exactly to implement these controls as well. Post which we'll be talking about a little bit about the payment security risk assessment, because once you go through the entire guidelines, you will get to know that the entire guidelines start from a governance perspective, and inside the governance, if you dig, let's say, deep down, you will understand that everything is dependent upon the risk assessment and the risk management of that organization. And that's how the entire policy, the entire guidelines have been drafted over here. And then accordingly, we'll be going ahead for a Q&A session. So without further ado, let's start. Let's look from a global perspective first. Let's try to understand that what exactly is the breach exposure of specifically financial sector from a global perspective. Now, what they did was that, let's say the market analysis, not of CISA, but yes, I'm talking about it from a global indexing perspective over here. They've added another 149 companies, and they said that the total breach sources varied till, let's say, 2267. When I say total breach sources, it means that, let's say, from where all the breach can start, from where all the breach can be initiated as well. And these number of breach sources they identified in these many companies, that there is a probability that these particular breach sources can be exploited, and accordingly an exfiltrator, or let's say a particular threat or malware can enter into an organization as well. And these many breach sources impacted another 13 million worth of records. 13 million records was, let's say, can be actually impacted due to these many sources, which results in another 79 million total assets which got impacted is this because of the same. And now talking about the other statistics from the control perspective, another 77% is the, let's say, the password reusability index. Now, what exactly do we mean by that? It means that if, let's say, you have put a particular password on Amazon, from where exactly you are doing shopping, the same password you might be using locally inside your office as well. The same password you might be using, let's say, at any other, let's say, shops or websites or whatever you have, which means that if the intruder, if the exfiltrator is able to compromise a single password, they'll be able to compromise all of your accounts. And 77% reusability is quite scary in nature. And when we again talk about the specifics inside a financial institution, you will see that the total PII assets, the total personally identifiable information assets in these many organizations varies from the 42 million 42 million worth of PII assets are there across the main. And the total corporate exposed credentials are another, let's say, 2 million over here. Now, one particular thing I want to, let's say, clarify over here, that what exactly are we talking about, or let's say, what exactly this total corporate exposed credentials? These are basically the C-level executives, the directors, or let's say the board of directors, and these types of people whose credentials have already been exposed. It's available in the market and it's available for selling as well. 2 million plus, you can say, corporate people, let's say, have been exposed, or let's say the credentials have been exposed over here. Okay, with these many, let's say, people, or let's say with this much, you can say, user exposure which is happening across the market. So what exactly, let's say, all these things tells us? This tells us that the financial sector as of now is one of the, let's say, most attractive user base for all the hackers, for all the intruders, because ultimately all of the hackers, intruders and all, okay, do whatever they are doing because of money. Why not just go for the financial institutions where they have the money, where let's say all the financial things and everything are, let's say, subdued? And that is why exactly, if you'll see the current cybersecurity state of Singapore as well, you'll see a lots and lots of breaches happening. So first, let's start from a global perspective. First, let's start from, let's say, not subjected to financial institutions. We saw in 2020 that a multinational aviation oriented subsidiary of Singapore got breached with another 1 terabytes of sensitive data being exposed. In Feb 2021, another 130,000 customers got compromised. In March, another 580,000. In July, another 3.7 million customer records were gone. What exactly this tells us? This tells us that even during this COVID era, even during these particular COVID times when, let's say, majority of us are facing challenges because of something or the other, whatever is happening across us, these hackers, these intruders have got their own perks, have got their own, you can say, threats, have got their own vulnerability or weakness around us. And accordingly, they are trying to exploit, or they are already exploiting each and every one of them. You'll not believe me, but actually the dwell time nowadays, that okay, a particular malware comes inside your organization, stays over there, and let's say acts after a certain period of time. So that particular certain period of time nowadays goes from the 200 250 days. It means that these particular organizations who have got compromised, the malware would have been sitting over there, let's say pre-COVID era. And when they understood that these particular organizations, their controls have weakened, their controls have gone down, that is where they got to know that, okay, let's hit them at this particular weakest point. And that accordingly, let's say, uh, help them in so many breaches as well. So let's look at a, let's say, a very live case as well. Now, this particular, let's say the breach analysis, or let's say this particular breach happened between, let's say, August 2017 and July 2018. Particular advanced persistent threat group actually tried to compromise, or let's say compromised actually, one of the health services inside Singapore. Another 1.5 million patients' data was actually breached, including their gender, their name, the contact details, and the other things. And 159,000 patients actually had additional medical data as well, which was stolen on top of this 1.5 million, let's say the patients. And this particular 159,000, what I'm talking about over here, actually includes the Prime Minister of Singapore as well. Even his data was actually compromised based upon the report what we have gone through. So how exactly this particular breach happened? This particular breach happened from a normal, let's say, a workstation, which was deployed across a healthcare institution. Now, this particular workstation can be any laptop or desktop or whatever the case might be. Okay. And then accordingly, let's say these guys compromised the very first thing, which was the workstation A. From the workstation A, they moved into, let's say, another workstation, which was, let's say, any other laptop or desktop, whatever they were using. And the other workstation was used to compromise basically the VDI, which is the virtual desktop infrastructure, which is the Citrix server. Now, Citrix servers, of course, were sitting, let's say, on the cloud or let's say on-prem or whatever the case might be. But these guys got to, let's say, access the core of the gateway. When I say gateway, it means that the Citrix servers actually act as a gateway to the critical data, to the critical PII data, which was sitting in the SCMDB servers. So initially, first of all, they compromised the workstation A. Now, once they have compromised the workstation A, they did let's say a lateral movement and went to workstation B. Now, workstation B had access to the Citrix server, right? So from this particular Citrix server, they went ahead, queried the SCM database, and the SCM database was where, let's say, all these records and everything was there. I told you just that, okay, 1.5 million patient records were compromised. This is where, let's say, the 1.5 million patient records were there. And then accordingly, let's say they were able to compromise, they transferred the data again to the Citrix server. Via the Citrix server, they transferred it back to the workstation A. From there, they exfiltrated it to the outside. That's how all these things happen. And of course, many of you would know that, okay, if everything is started from workstation A, then they would have been subject to a phishing attack, then the credentials would have been compromised at the healthcare institution A. And that's how, let's say, these particular things happen. And this very latest as well, this is 2018-19, and the data, or let's say the breach data might be available even right now as well on the, let's say, on the dark web as well. And actually, this is the way reason why exactly these mass release new guidelines. We do understand that, okay, this particular, let's say the case study which I showed you was talking about the medical health, was talking about the medical health data. But all of us have to learn from others' mistakes as well, right? It's not, let's say, it's not wise that till the time we are not impacted, we shouldn't learn from, let's say, the other things, whatever is happening around us. That is the very reason Mars understood that, okay, this is the right time where we should address all the pain points of the industry and accordingly request the industries to actually comply with the few guidelines as well, whatever is there. So 93% of the organizations was facing cyber attacks due to remote working conditions. 90% of the Singapore residents said that, okay, they have been a victim of unauthorized access to their networks, the malware injection and all. And 89% of them said that, okay, there is a huge gap in the risk management, the incident response as well. And that is what, let's say, led Mars to come out with the technology risk management guidelines on 18 January 2021, so that we'll be able to combat heightened cybersecurity risks specifically during this particular COVID era, and accordingly strengthen the entire security posture of financial institutions. So what is the scope and applicability of these? Of course, many of you will know that the banking institutions, the let's say the payment banks, the digital banks, and all those things will be coming under, let's say, the scope of these particular of this particular guidelines as such. So if you'll see these particular guidelines have, or let's say, are trying to address the technology and the cyber risk. So specifically, they are talking about the IT sector. Specifically, they are talking about the IT assets inside these financial institutions. They are talking about the cloud technologies as well, application programming interfaces, rapid software development, and so forth. And this is one of the few, or let's say, this is one of the, let's say, you can say, very subset of, let's say, the guidelines, or let's say, few guidelines who have come out with the IoT as well, and said that if you, let's say, you are having the Internet of Things, or let's say these kinds of, you can say, applications or devices across your organization, or let's say across a financial institution, then accordingly you have to secure those IoT devices as well. Latest, they are also talking about security control with respect to the technological development and delivery life cycle. That is something which we'll see at a later point as well, that over here they are not just talking about software development life cycle, but they're also talking about system development life cycle as well, from the acquisition of that particular asset to the time you are not decommissioning that particular asset. Each and everything, how exactly the entire process should go, they are talking about everything, which is, you can say, quite stringent, or let's say quite comprehensive in nature, based upon what we have seen, or let's say what other guidelines we have seen as well inside the market. And that's why they are providing the best practices for these financial institutions with guidance, so that they can address the technology and the cyber risks as well in the nature. So that gives a particular, let's say, notion in mind that who are exactly these particular financial institutions, who from this, about whom are we talking about over here? So we are talking basically about the retail and commercial banks, the mortgage companies, the internet banks, the insurance companies, the central banks, credit unions, investment companies, and brokerage firms. All of these actually are comprised inside the financial institution. However, Mars can always come out and say that, okay, they are only taking a subset of these. Okay, that depends, of course, upon, let's say, the Mars and which all regulated entities they are taking care of. Okay, however, at a very, very broad level, these are, let's say 7 to 8 types of financial institutions which fall under this particular criteria. Now, we understood that why exactly, or let's say, what was the need at this particular COVID times for these particular guidelines. We understood that, okay, the breaches are happening at, let's say, at a very, very rapid pace. And why exactly the breaches are happening? Because of the accelerated digital transformation as well. You will see that Singapore themselves have grown at least 83% from a digital transformation perspective during the COVID era. 78% of the organizations have moved to cloud as well during this particular COVID era itself. And right now, I'm talking about the figures of only Singapore. Whereas if you compare them with Hong Kong or Australia and the New Zealand, so Hong Kong only accelerated with 79% from a digital transformation perspective, and the cloud movement with 76%. Similarly, Australia and New Zealand was at the third place with 59% of the digital transformation and 52% of the cloud movement. So you will see Singapore is at the highest. And accordingly, the intruders also know that, okay, once this digital transformation is coming, they will have a hell lot of things to actually go around, shop, and then try to exploit as well. So if you'll see, the mass has come prepared over here. They have taken into perspective each and every aspect of a financial institution, and accordingly, they have come out with these guidelines. So first of all, they basically start from the risk governance and oversight. Now, the risk governance, or let's say the technology risk governance and oversight, plays a very, very crucial role in each and every, let's say, financial institution. The reason being is because if you are not defining the policies at the highest level, if your C level, if your board of, let's say, directors and let's say those particular people do not adhere to the guidelines, the people down below, the organizations or the organization resources down below, the assets down below will never follow the same. That's why you need a thorough commitment from the top management, and then accordingly, let's say it goes down in fashion as well. And that is the way reason why exactly they are starting with the risk governance and oversight, and then the risk management framework as well. In all of these, or let's say in the starting itself, they have started with risk. They have started with the risk, like let's say governance, risk management, and things like that. And that is what gives us the, let's say, the exact flavor of the entire standard of these particular entire guidelines, that the entire standard will be risk driven in perspective. And that's why once you go inside the risk management framework, you'll understand that talk about the identification of the assets, assessment, treatment, the monitoring review, and let's say the other practices as well. Now, once they have talked about the risk management, about the risk governance and all, they talk about the project management and security by design. Now, as I told you, that these particular guidelines are not just talking about SDLC, the normal SDLC, which you and me, let's say, have already gone through. Okay, they are talking about, let's say, not just a software development life cycle, but they're also talking about a system development life cycle as well. And that is what you see in the project management and security by design as well. That from the time you are trying to procure a particular asset, from that time itself, how exactly you can infringe the security parameters and how exactly you can secure the assets from there. Starting from even the acquisition, or starting from even when you are finalizing the vendors, even from that time, the security has to be in the DNA of that particular entire process. The same thing goes from the software application development and management as well, which is the common practices which many of us know, which talks about the secure code review practices, the agile software development, the DevSecOps as well, and of course the API developments. Now, DevSecOps, many of us are quite aware about the same. However, for those of you who, let's say, might not be, the DevSecOps is a process where the deployment of the code into the production, how exactly it can be streamlined, how exactly it can be secured as well. And after the deployment, whenever you are doing changes, whenever, let's say, you are updating the particular source code as well, how exactly you are securing the entire tunnel over there. CI/CD pipeline is one of the, let's say, the most used methods or mechanisms which organizations use, and then accordingly, let's say, they go ahead with the same as well. Now, once we have understood about the software application development lifecycle, now let's go inside the assets. Let's talk about the IT. And that's where they start with IT service management as well. So primarily, first of all, what they say is that let's define a framework for IT service management. How exactly you'll be procuring the assets, how exactly, let's say, asset labeling will happen, how exactly you will be creating the asset inventory, and hence so forth. And that's why they start with a framework, then the configuration management of those assets, the patch management, change management, software release management, incident management, problem management. All of these things come under the IT service management umbrella. Now, once IT service management have been taken care of, you have deployed the resources. Now it's time to take care of the risks as well, because all of us know that if there is an IT assets, it will go down some way or the other. And that's why they come out with the IT resilience, where they talk about the availability, the recoverability of those systems. Let's say the disaster recovery plan has to be tested up. the system backup recovery, the data center resilience, and hence so forth. So once we have understood about the IT service management and about the IT resiliency, okay, it's very important for us to understand about the access controls, because now we have, let's say, procured an asset. Now we have done the labeling and everything. Now we know that, okay, I have a DR site as well. Now let's go deeper. Let's try to understand from an access control perspective that, let's say, what all things, or let's say, who all will be having access to which all systems. Now, over here, I will say that Mars has gone pretty far and talked about each and everything which can happen from a cyber, or let's say from an access control perspective as well. They have talked about multi-factor authentication. They have talked about biometric system access as well. And they have also talked about something known as, which is known as the behavioral access systems as well. However, behavioral access is something which they have included in the, let's say, the online financial services also, which is which, let's say, we'll discuss in some time. But they have tried to make sure that whatever best you can do from an access control perspective, please try to do it over here. Then they talk about the, let's say, the cryptography, the data and the infrastructure security, the cyber security operations, like the one which you can see. And inside the cyber security operations, you will have the threat intelligence, the event monitoring, the incident response and management. So basically your MDR solutions, your, let's say, the FDR, the forensic detection and response, the managed detection and response, these types of solutions are the need of the hour based upon these particular guidelines. So inside the cybersecurity operations, they are talking about all of these stuffs. Then they talk about cybersecurity assessment, where they talk about the vulnerability assessment and pen testing. They talk about, let's say, the cyber exercises which you have to conduct, maybe the drills what you have to conduct. They also talk about the breach attack simulation, where you can evaluate the controls what you have deployed, and accordingly, let's say, help the organization, or let's say, try to analyze that, okay, how many controls, or let's say what level of controls are going well enough over there. Based upon that, they have talked about the intelligence based scenario design and the remediation management as well. So all these things come under cybersecurity assessment. Then they talk about online financial services, in which they're talking about the customers now. Now, from the customer perspective, they are saying that, okay, all the customers have to be authenticated. And specifically, they have mentioned over here that the multi-factor authentication has to be enabled for the customers whosoever are accessing their application. And specifically in the times when, let's say, they are doing critical activities, like, let's say, for example, they are changing the, let's say, the address or something like that. At that time, the signatures, or the transaction signing also needs to be done. They have very, let's say, silently, but in a very, very nice manner, they have also mentioned that the credentials, whatever, let's say, are being sent across, and let's say, whenever, let's say, we are having such PII data elements when it's being sent across, you have to have end-to-end encryption as well inside place whenever you are using these types of applications and you are giving access to the customers. And that is the very reason why exactly inside the online financial services, they also have particular control where they talk about the customer education and communication, that the customers always need to be educated that, okay, what all are the security best practices, how exactly they should be handling these applications, the mobile applications, the web application, whatever they are using. Okay, and how exactly they make sure that, okay, they are changing these particular passwords as well. And as I told you in the very starting, that the reusability index, it varied from 70 to 80%. So those things actually need to be communicated to the customers as well, that please do not use the same password whatever you might be using, let's say, for the other applications, for the other websites and things like that. Otherwise, one compromise will just compromise each and every asset in which that particular credentials have been used for access as well. And they talk about the fraud monitoring also over here. Now, fraud monitoring is something where these guys have said that, okay, it should be in real time perspective, so that accordingly, if we see a spike in the transaction of a particular user, then accordingly, let's say, you should, let's say, raise an alert and accordingly try to block that particular card, or that particular transaction based upon the case to case basis. And then lastly, they talk about the IT audit, where, let's say, competent resources have to be there inside your organization, and then accordingly they have to perform audits, they have to perform these audit procedures based upon time to time basis as well inside the organization. Now, one particular thing which I would like to highlight over here, that in during the entire you can say the mass guideline, during the entire guidance, it's only at one place where they have mentioned, or let's say where they have specifically mentioned a frequency for let's say evaluation for implementation of these particular controls, which is in the awareness and training, where they have mentioned that okay, it has to happen annually. Apart from that, the other things, they are going based upon the risk perspective, they are going based upon the risk management perspective. Whatever, let's say, organization is deciding, that's how they can let's say do it. Maybe let's say a VAPT practices can go in a quarterly, can go in a monthly, depending upon an organization risk exposure. Similarly, this is the BCPDR procedures and the cyber drill exercise and all, again depending upon a particular organization let's say risk appetite. And lastly, they have added three annexures specifically where they talk about critical places, or let's say where they talk about critical controls, which let's say might have been missed. However, I'll tell you, because we have gone through the entire standard, we have gone through the entire guidelines, all these things have been taken into perspective, but even then they wanted to emphasize specifically on these three pointers. So first of all, they talk from an application security testing perspective. Inside the application security testing, they start with, let's say, okay, you have to do a fuzzy logic testing, or let's say a fuzz testing, and then the normal application pen test procedure, which is the SAST, which is the static application security testing, DAST, which is the dynamic application security testing, and then EAST as well, which is the interactive one. Okay, so all three types of, let's say, the application security testing are required to be performed based upon these particular guidelines. Then, as of course, it had been launched into let's say January 2021, and they have to take care of the remote workforce. So BYOD security is the need of the hour, and they have talked about the mobile device management policies and how exactly the encryption has to happen on these particular devices, which let's say are remote in nature. And then lastly, they talk about the mobile application security as well, where they're talking about secure code review practices, and let's say you should not install these particular applications on rooted device, or let's say jailbroken device and things like that. So they have given all the, let's say, the necessary recommendations over there. So before we go on a poll break, just a quick thing, that we have gone through the entire risk, or let's say the entire risk management guidelines, and that is something, let's say, is the need of the hour today for all the financial institutions in the market. Once you are back from the poll break, we'll talk about it more. We can launch the poll. All right.
Here are
So
the
the yeah, please go ahead. Sorry.
here are the poll results, Kaushik. You can comment on it.
Sure, thanks a lot for that. So, how well is your organization prepared with the technology risk management guidelines laid by MAS? That okay, you are getting the audit done, and you are in the process. Though no, you need guidance and things like that. Okay, so it's a mixed feeling. It's a mixed response, which is good. Which is good in nature. So that gives let's say a little bit of clarity to all of us as well, that how exactly things are moving forward. Okay, fantastic. Now, why exactly to implement these new guidelines? Why exactly you as a financial institution, or let's say you as a, let's say as a veteran of financial institution, might come back and say that okay, you have ISO 27001, you have PCI, you have n number of let's say different compliances which you are maintaining, but why exactly these particular guidelines? So to understand that, what we did was that we went again global in perspective, and we went to something known as a European Systemic, or let's say Systemic Risk Board of Financial Supervision, and we took help of this entire, you can say, the architecture, which is known as a conceptual systemic risk model. Now, what exactly this particular risk model tells us is that first of all, they try to talk about the context. That is, the circumstances in which a cyber incident might happen, which is all about the probability. This is all about the cyber threat, the vulnerability, the assets, the countermeasures, and things like that. Now, if you'll see, the probability is there, or let's say the probability is where we need to focus, because that is where the risk assessment will be performed. That is how, let's say, you will be evaluating all the controls inside your organization as well. And if, let's say, in the context phase itself, you are able to address majority of the things, that will be fairly easy for you to manage the entire, you can cyber security drill over here. Now, what they said was that, okay, let's say in the context phase, there was a probability that, okay, a particular breach, a particular thing will happen. And let's say it happens. Let's say a particular, a particular vulnerability, a particular thing gets impacted. And that is where they go into the next phase of shock. Now, inside the shock phase, what they're saying is that what exact impact has happened because of whatever, let's say, breach or whatever things have happened. So the consequences can be technical or business. Technical from a loss of availability, confidentiality, integrity, authenticity, accountability, non-repudiation, etc. And the business impact, financial, operational, and so forth. So these are the consequences which might happen if we are not able to address the context, or let's say the probability, the very first one of the cyber risk in a rightful manner. Now, once let's say a particular shock has happened, and accordingly, let's say the organization has already, let's say, got impacted due to, let's say, particular breach or let's say particular vulnerability, that is where, let's say, that particular vulnerability, that particular thing starts to amplify, starts to grow bigger as well. If you remember the, let's say, the forensics case study which we discussed some time back, where actually we talked about that how exactly from a single workforce station, that particular malware, or let's say that particular hacker or intruder went to the workforce station B, and from there they compromised Citrix, and from Citrix they went into, let's say, the database which was having, let's say, 1.5 million worth of health records, and then accordingly they compromised. So that particular stage where they were trying to do lateral movement and everything, that is actually happening in the amplification, because that's where they have started with a single vulnerability and they're trying to amplify and grow the vulnerabilities as well. So system amplifiers, as you can see, uncertainty, erosion, adverse conditions, ineffective response, time sensitivity, and so forth. And these amplifiers will be, let's say, the persistent, persiveness, the concurrency, and the speed of the particular transmission as well. And how exactly this particular, let's say, this amplification, or let's say the entire thing increases based upon how many vulnerabilities or how many, let's say, the assets they are able to compromise, and accordingly how exactly they are moving forward as well. And that is why, if you'll see, the amplification phase will always talk about the contributing factors that actually helped that particular shock to transmit across the system, and accordingly increase the impact as well. Because once that particular impact increases and reaches a particular threshold point, that's where a systemic event happens. When I say systemic event, that is where the exfiltration of data has happened. That is where, let's say, the intruder came into your organization and went away with the data over there. Okay. Now, this is the very reason, because okay, why exactly am I saying this is the very reason? Because this entire systemic, let's say, the model has been taken, or say has been, let's say, framed because of the financial institutions, specifically the EU, the European Union. Those guys have come across and they know that, let's say, a financial institution is, or let's say, will be the target majority of the times. And that is why, if, let's say, organization understand that this is how exactly, let's say, a particular intruder or a malware will propagate inside, let's say, an organization, then accordingly you will be able to get hold of that particular malware, that particular intrusion at one single point in time, and accordingly help your organization as well in the rightful manner. And that is where, let's say, we talk about how to implement as well. Now, on the left hand side, you will see that these are, let's say, primarily all the controls which is required basis upon, let's say, the MAS guidelines or any other cybersecurity standard as well across the globe. However, the need of the question of the hour is that, okay, how to implement this? And that is where we suggest that, okay, follow the NIST cybersecurity framework, where you should first of all identify inside the organization the assets, the things, or let's say the scope and things like that. Post which, start protecting. So once you are starting to protect, at that time you also need to understand what exact controls you have already implemented. Map it with the risk assessment and see if you need more controls on top of that, and accordingly start protecting. Now, who exactly will tell you these controls? These particular controls have to be taken up from these particular mass guidelines, which we were discussing till now. Okay. Post which, let's say we'll be talking about the detection, where we'll be talking about the antivirus, the anti-spy, the spywares and all. Okay. These are there so that accordingly, let's say they detect any of the anomalies, any of the challenges inside, and that is where your SIM solution, your MDR solution, or let's say your FDR solution will also come into perspective. Then you talk about respond. So if you remember that we had a particular thing about the IT service management, about the IT resilience, where we talked about the incident management, problem management, and DRP and everything. That's where the respond will come, and then recover. That, okay, a particular thing has happened, but how exactly will you recover from it? How exactly you have performed, let's say, an RCA on top of that, and things like that. So if you have implemented, if you have assessed your organization based upon the NIST cybersecurity framework, then we believe that, let's say, your organization will be able to make up and will be able to implement these particular mass guidelines as well at the end of the day. One particular, let's say, efficient method to perform these kinds of things is something which we can do as a, let's say, the vendor risk assessment as well, where we use the formal approach based upon the ISO 27005 and, let's say, the Octave framework, and then accordingly help organizations in achieve a cybersecurity posture as well, where we start with the normal, where the same things what we just discussed some time back about the risk management, where we start with the identification of the assets, then assessment, then treatment, help you in treatment basically. And then accordingly, you have to monitor, review, and reposition that particular thing as well. And that's how basically the risk assessment as well grows. So to, let's say, go along, or let's say scale this particular risk assessment process, we have a particular tool which is known as CISA RA, which helps in automation of majority of the stuffs over here, and helps organizations in achieving this risk assessment, this risk management in a very, very efficient fashion. Otherwise, the days of, let's say, the Excel and Word and doing a normal case analysis, those, let's say, days are gone. Now you need everything to be input inside a particular tool, so that each and every vulnerability, each and every threat, whatever has happened, let's say in the past 1 year, in the past 6 months, all of those things go directly in a particular tool, in a particular application. That's from where you will get to know that, okay, what exactly is your exposure, and accordingly you can start working on the same. Because nowadays all of us know that we don't have time. We don't have time to interview people. We don't have time to just go along and, let's say, try to identify risk by just interviewing, or let's say by just interacting. And that is the way reason why exactly all of us need a tool for this particular risk assessment, for this particular risk management. That gives, let's say, the poll question 2 over here. We launch that, please. Ashwini, are the poll results out?
Kaushik, your comment.
Yeah. Okay. The poll results are out.
Kaushik, poll results are out.
Okay,
It's
because
visible on the screen.
Okay, okay, sure. So 50, so the same thing again happened, that 50% said that, okay, yes, connect with us, and 50% said that, okay, no, we are good. All right, fine. Thanks a lot for that, let's say, response. And let's just cover the last slide, or let's say the last few things over here, and then we'll just wrap up. Now, how exactly CISA can help? We told you about the risk assessment. We told you about that CISA is basically a global forensic-driven cybersecurity company. We'll help you in the NIST framework. We can help you in any other let's say cybersecurity certifications and audits as well. And this is the time where you can let's say ask any of the questions, whatever you guys have. And meantime, till let's say you guys are coming out with questions, let me do a quick recap as well, that what exactly we gone through the entire times, right? So first of all, we started with the use case scenario where we tried to understand that what exactly is the exposure of the financial institutions right now at a global level and then at a domestic level inside the Singapore area. Based upon those particular statistics, we understood that yes, it was the need of the hour for Mars to actually come out with these particular latest guidelines, because the digital transformation has, let's say, has gone many folds, especially in this particular COVID-19 era. And then accordingly, let's say organizations need to, or let's say the financial institutions need to secure themselves as well. Based upon that, we understood the scoping and the applicability of let's say these particular guidelines. Post which we talked about that what exactly are these financial institutions. After which we talked about all the controls, and we went let's say a bit deeper as well into those particular controls, so that accordingly, let's say we can understand, we can identify that how to implement these things. Then we understood a particular, let's say, a very famous model of the systemic risk assessment, or the systemic, you can say, management, where if we identify that this is how exactly a malware, this is how exactly intruder, this is how exactly, let's say, an adversary will come into contact with your organization. And if you're able to map each and every step, then accordingly you will be able to secure your organization as well. Because if you knew how exactly somebody is coming in, then you know that, okay, at which particular point you can, let's say, block them. If you didn't know that, okay, how exactly they'll propagate, how exactly they will come in, or say what are things they can exploit, then of course you cannot do that, right? So that's why try to map those things, let's say with your organization, with your financial institution, so that accordingly you can, let's say, map it and accordingly block it. And after that, we talked about that how to implement this, where we talked about the NIST cybersecurity framework and, let's say, the governance frameworks and things like that. And lastly, we talked about that if you are looking forward to automate the risk assessment process, which is again the need of the hour right now, because those days are long gone where we used to interview people and then accordingly come out with a risk assessment or the risk assessment report and everything. Then you need a particular tool, an automated risk assessment tool, and CISA is there for the rescue. On that particular note, let's start and see if we have any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kaushik, for this lovely session. And I guess most of the queries which our audience have asked, they are clarified on that. But we've got one question from Mr. John. The question is, does these mask guidelines applies only for the banks? And the second part of this question is how payment service providers can get benefit from this.
All right. So, so as we told you in the very starting, that this is where exactly, so these are the, let's say, the things, or let's say these are the institutions which should be complying with this. However, if let's say your specific organization needs to understand that, let's say, is it applicable for you or not, and if you are not coming under the category of these banks, or let's say the mortgage companies, the internet banks and things like that, then it's better that we can raise a query to Mars, and then accordingly. However, this is where also these are the institutions which, let's say, have to comply with this. Now, coming to the second point, that how exactly you can benefit, even if you are a payment gateway or a payment aggregator, or let's say a payment service provider, whatever the case might be, then these particular guidelines are agnostic, are, let's say, homogeneous in fashion. When I say agnostic and homogeneous fashion, it means that every organization need to have these particular controls, irrespective if you are into financial institution category, if you're into payment gateway or payment aggregator. And all of us can benefit from these particular guidelines directly. What you need to do, what is the need of the hour is start with a risk assessment, start with the risk management approach. Accordingly, you'll get to know that where exactly the gaps are, and then accordingly start rectifying it one by one based upon the guidance what Mars has given to you, and accordingly you'll be able to benefit with the same. Bharat, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kaushik, for this. And another question that we have, I guess we are over time. We're going to take this last question now. So the question from the question is basically on, can you share more information about CPSI training program? So I think I'll be able to take it up. So yes, of course, we'll be able to share the course content in the agenda as well with you guys. Probably if you want to have a look at it, and we'll be happy to host you for that particular training program that we have. It's not basically a training program, but it's a certification program, which is of 2 days. And out after that particular training, you can get the certification done once you clear that particular examination. And that's it from our side. I guess for rest of the questions, we'll be able to send the reply very soon. And the recordings and the PPT for this particular webinar that we have conducted will be uploaded on the YouTube channel of CISA, where you can have the access from, and you can pass it on to your friends and colleagues who have missed to join this webinar today. And the presentation also will be available. If you want that presentation, probably you can reach out or mail it to us, and we'll be happy to share that presentation to us. That's it. That's it from our side. Thank you so much for joining in and having patience with us. Kaushik, any final remarks?
No, I believe that we already exceeded time. So thanks a lot, team, for joining in. If you have any queries, then as mentioned by Bharat, you can always reach out to us and accordingly be able to help. Thanks a lot. Have a good one and safe one.